Horns of a Dilemma, the podcast of the Texas National Security Review, TNSR. I'm Doyle Hodges, Executive Editor of TNSR. In this episode of Horns, we listen to a conversation between Professor Aaron O'Connell of the Clements Center at the University of Texas, Austin, and Michel Paradis, a law professor whose book, Last Mission to Tokyo, examines the aftermath of the Doolittle raid. Many of us are familiar with the Doolittle raid in April 1942, when Colonel Jimmy Doolittle led a group of Army aviators launching B-25 bombers from Navy aircraft carriers to bomb Tokyo on a one-way mission. It's been immortalized in films such as 30 Seconds Over Tokyo or the much less well-received Pearl Harbor. What many of us are less aware of is the aftermath of the raid. All but 8 of the raiders escaped captivity. However, those 8 were tried for war crimes by the Japanese and sentenced to death. 3 were executed. 5 had their sentences commuted. Paradis' book takes a look at the trial of the Japanese lawyers after the war who arranged the military commission and trial of the Doolittle raiders. In doing so, it's an examination not only of a fascinating episode in history, but what it means to try to achieve standards of justice, decency, and a fair trial in the midst of conflict. Let's listen in.
I'm Aaron O'Connell, and I'm the Director of Research here at the Clements Center of National Security and an Associate Professor in the History Department. And today, I'm your guest host for today's podcast. Today, we're going to talk to an old friend of mine, Dr. Michel Paradis, who has something of 3 different lives as a lawyer, a teacher, and an author. Let me introduce Michel, and then we'll turn to the subject of our podcast today about war crimes, torture, World War II, military commissions, and the importance of international law. But first, let me introduce Michel. In his day job, Michel is a senior attorney in the U.S. Department of Defense Military Commissions Defense Organizations, where he represents detainees at the U.S. Naval Station at Guantanamo Bay. Michel is also a teacher and a true public intellectual on matters of human rights and national security law. He teaches military law at Columbia Law School and Georgetown Law School, and his writings on national security have appeared in The Atlantic, The New York Times, The Washington Post, The Wall Street Journal, and many other publications. And finally, Michel is also an author. Simon & Schuster has just published his first book, Last Mission to Tokyo, The Extraordinary Story of the Doolittle Raiders and Their Final Fight for Justice. This book has just taken off since being published in July. The New York Times gave it a rave review, calling it engrossing, and it's earned the praise of such diverse characters as the novelist John Grisham and the Pulitzer Prize-winning historian of Japan, John Dower. Michel, welcome. We're happy to have you here today.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be on.
Great. So, Michel, you're here to talk about this fabulous book, Last Mission to Tokyo. I think most of our listeners have heard of the Doolittle raid before, but the thing that you've brought to light here is that the story of the Doolittle raid really isn't just a story of a raid. It's the story of a raid, a rescue, and 2 trials. And it's those trials that your book spends the most time on and really has some astonishing reveals. So to get our audience situated, can you just give us a sense of why'd you write this book?
So, I came upon it quite accidentally. I was, working, as you said, in the Department of Defense on the Guantanamo issues, and this was the end of the Bush administration. And Michael Mukasey had just been appointed Attorney General, and there was a renewed debate about whether waterboarding constituted torture. And we had heard in our office that there was an old case from World War II in which what we had heard was the Japanese were prosecuted for waterboarding. And so we sent a young Marine captain out to the National Archives to dig up this case and pulled this transcript out, which I don't think had been seen probably at that point in 70 years, which I don't think it's been seen at that point in 60 years. And I cracked it open one day when it was kind of a slow day. One of our cases was in some random legal limbo, as the Guantanamo cases often are. And I started reading it. And the first thing that struck me was that it was about the Doolittle raid. And, the Doolittle raid is one of those legends of World War II. I remember being a kid at an air show in Pennsylvania where I grew up. And, I was there to see the F-14 Tomcats because Top Gun was popular at the time. But someone pointed out what was a B-25 bomber. And they told me that was the first plane to bomb Japan. And so, the Doolittle raid has been this fixture of American folklore throughout the 20th century. And as I read the trial transcript, I realized that this was probably the most incredible legal story I had ever read. And I think the thing that disturbed me, certainly the more that I read the transcript, was not only is it just an extraordinary story about an extraordinary event, all or many of the things that I was confronting on a day-to-day basis, not the least being is waterboarding torture, were issues in this trial back in 1946. And the thing that really just hit me in the chest was all of the things that we were prosecuting the Japanese for doing were things that the United States was in one way or another doing or complicit in doing in Guantanamo. And so that's the kind of story that just immediately grabs you.
Absolutely. Yes, I can see how that would send shivers down your spine. So, yes, you've already referenced one of the trials here, which is, of course, the U.S. trial of Japanese officials for war crimes. But that's the end of the story. So let's get to the beginning. Let's just briefly cover for our audience the story of the raid. So can you set the scene for us? It's April 1942. It's just 5 months after Pearl Harbor. The United States has not hit back in any way. The Japanese have consolidated control all over the Pacific. And then somebody comes up with an idea of a way to hit back. What happens?
Well, that's right. And not only haven't we hit back, it's the war's disaster at that point. Our campaign in North Africa is at best stalled. We've lost our largest colony, the Philippines in the Pacific. General Douglas MacArthur ignominiously sort of floats away in the middle of the night, and soon to follow is the Bataan Death March. So, this is a dark period of the war. And this plan, this idea, really not a plan, an idea comes up. Can we bomb Japan? Is there any way to bomb Japan? And the head of the Army Air Forces, Hap Arnold, gets this sort of cockamamie plan from a Navy submariner, says, why don't we take bombers off an aircraft carrier? And he hands this sort of idea to Jimmy Doolittle, who is at the time a lieutenant colonel, not a career military man, quite the opposite. He was a stunt pilot throughout much of the 1930s, famous for things that seemed completely insane. He famously took off from an airfield in Long Island, having blacked out his entire windshield, takes off, flies 14 miles overhead in a circle, and then lands right from where he had taken off without ever being able to see a foot in front of him. He was fined for unlawful aerial acrobatics. He's actually the first man, or woman for that matter, the first person to cross the United States in a single day, which is sort of one of the really, truly remarkable moments in American history. If you really begin to think about this period in the early part of the 20th century as the United States is coming together. So Jimmy Doolittle is a stunt pilot. He's this guy who, is kind of seen by a lot of people to be all sizzle and no steak. But the truth is he's an aeronautical engineer from MIT. And so when Hap Arnold asks him, is this possible? The logical answer, the real answer is no, it's completely impossible. You can't do this. But he figures it out. He engineers around the problem and ultimately comes up with a sort of re-engineered B-25 bombers, which are these big fat Army planes with glass noses, and manages to get 16 of them off an aircraft carrier on what was understood at the time to be a one-way mission over Japan.
Which they're, of course, never designed to do. These airplanes were never meant to go off aircraft carriers. Man, Navy aviation wasn't really that good at getting off aircraft carriers.
Or landing.
It's an extraordinary story. Nobody thought they'd come back. And what is their mission? What are they to do? And what happens?
So Jimmy Doolittle, it's only once they're on the aircraft carrier that they're all told what this crazy plan is all about. For the previous month, they basically just keep drilling on trying to take off in 500 feet. An airplane that's designed to take off in about 1,500 feet, that should be said. And what he ultimately says, 2 days into the voyage, the loudspeaker cracks in and they say, this task force is bound for Tokyo. And everyone just goes, nuts, as you can possibly imagine. And what he ends up doing is he brings all his pilots in and he hands out targets. And he says, these are the major industrial military targets in Tokyo, Nagoya, and Kobe. Pick your targets. Learn the maps, and because we're going to fly in a one-way mission off this aircraft carrier to attack these military targets and then try to find a rallying point in Kyushu, China.
Where they'd have to jump out of the planes and then just come together, or they thought they'd actually land?
So they had been told that Chiang Kai-shek was going to set up an airstrip for them in Kyushu. But one of the, at least, reveals of this book is that airstrip was never created. There were all sorts of face covering stories put out about, well, they tried to set it up and then the guy crashed and his radio went dead or something like that. But the truth was that really up until the very eve of the raid, Chiang Kai-shek resisted supporting the Doolittle raid for fear of what the Japanese might do if China was seen as a landing pad for American army bombers. And so they end up flying over China for hours looking for this beacon that never appears. And all of them end up having to either jump out or a few of them ditch into the ocean. But miraculously, all but 3 of them survive. That's like the craziest part of this. And, anyone, who was looking at this with an honest eye in 1942 would have said, this is a suicide mission. And nevertheless, somehow all but 3 survive, and all but 8 of them, of the survivors, make it to safety. 5 make it to safety in Soviet Russia, where they're interned as prisoners of war. But the rest rally in Kuzhou, China, and Doolittle gets them all to safety. And it's really, it's the first victory of World War II. Its galvanizing effect on the United States really just can't be overstated.
That's certainly true. I mean, the stories, just take a look at any newspaper of the coverage of the Doolittle raid, and it is the final, it is, at least we've done something, and we've bombed Japan, we've punched them right in the nose. What's it like on the ground for the Japanese experiencing the raid? So they're targeting industrial facilities. They're targeting, it sounds like, legitimate targets in war.
Absolutely. Yeah. So, Jimmy Doolittle had, thought a lot about this and, was very careful to assign all of his men military targets, traditional military targets. That was core Army Air Corps school doctrine at the time. Is we, unlike the British who embraced strategic bombing pretty early in the war against Germany, we were very careful, particularly in the early years of the war, about only targeting military targets, what were seen as the industrial bottlenecks of the enemy's warfighting capacity. And the theory was that if you could knock out those bottlenecks, you could inhibit the ability of the enemy to wage their war. And there was even the pilots all drew cards actually on the deck when they told they were finally being going to punch back at Tokyo. All the pilots got together and drew cards to get to see who was going to bomb the Imperial Palace. Right, give one to Hirohito in the nose. But Doolittle put a stop to it. He said, "We do not want to give the Japanese any propaganda opportunities, period." He had seen how the German Blitz of London had galvanized public opinion, particularly after things like the Buckingham Palace was bombed. And so he was very adamant that we give the Japanese no excuses.
Fascinating. Okay, but so that means they hit only military targets. Were any civilians killed?
Well,
the bombs go astray. It's
exactly.
important to differentiate between their intentions, what they were trying to hit, and what they actually hit. So, what's that story?
Right. So, as laudable as the direction of their demolition bombs or the targeting of their demolition bombs was, they were also loaded with incendiary bombs, which, this is before the invention of napalm, but it was widely understood that Japan is a wooden country, and Tokyo a wooden city. And so the instructions from Doolittle to his pilots were to drop the incendiary bombs where they would, quote, do the most good, and really didn't leave any more instructions beyond that. And so what ended up happening was a lot of the incendiary bombs got dropped in residential areas, in which civilians were killed by virtue of their neighborhoods essentially burning down, or children being literally hit with these incendiary bombs because they thought they were leaflets in one case. And then there was the problem of strafing. At least one plane, actually no, I can say at least 2 planes, clearly and unambiguously used their guns to strafe what would be now identified as civilian targets. In one case, a group of fishing boats off the coast of Nagoya. And in one case, really the most notorious case, the Japanese really did torque up for all of its propaganda value. One of the planes flew over a school in a northern suburb of Tokyo and just strafed along the school as they flew by. And a young boy, a 12-year-old boy, was shot through the belly in his classroom and quickly bled out and died.
Okay, so it sounds like some ambiguous orders from Doolittle, and then also some actions that really don't fit inside any kind of paradigm of a military target there. So that's the raid. Let's now transition to the first trial. So all these Doolittle raiders, even though Doolittle manages to rally the vast majority of them and they assemble on the ground, they all end up, do they not, very quickly in far more dire circumstances.
8 of the 80 Doolittle raiders are quickly captured by the Japanese in China and taken into the custody of Japan's secret police, the Kempe Tai, where they are subjected to extremely brutal torture that is very familiar. When we were told that, this was a case involving the prosecution of the Japanese for waterboarding, that's because the Kempe Tai waterboarded the Doolittle raiders in order to get them to confess not only about the details of their mission, but also to admit to atrocities against the Japanese. And what to do with the Doolittle raiders becomes really one of the most roiling political issues in the Japanese cabinet. On the one hand, you have, the dubs, people like Shinigami Togo, the foreign minister, who had long fought for Japan's compliance with the Geneva Conventions. But on the other side, you have people like Hajime Sugiyama, who's the chief of staff of the army, and proposed executing the Doolittle raiders as publicly and summarily as possible in order to deter these kinds of American air raids on Japan from happening again. And Hideki Tojo, the prime minister and war minister, is kind of caught in a bind. This Japan of this period is, a bitterly divided, has a very bitterly divided politics. And so the solution he comes up with is he asks the lawyers. He goes to the lawyers in the war ministry and says, is there a legal way we can execute the Doolittle raiders? And the lawyers come back with the obvious answer, which is, no, absolutely not. You may not execute prisoners. But they send the question back and they're like, look, that's not the right answer. If you don't find a legal way to do this, the Kempe Tai are going to do it anyway and try and claim it was an accident or an escape. And no one will believe that. And so what the lawyers ultimately come up with is they say, well, if we prosecute the Doolittle raiders for war crimes, then we can sentence them to death as war criminals. And what we can do is we can create a military commission, essentially a special military tribunal for war crimes, in which to essentially launder our desire to execute them. And so that's what they do. In the August of 1942, the 8 Doolittle raiders are taken out of a Chinese dungeon in Shanghai and brought before a Japanese military commission, where they are whose proceedings, I should say, last maybe an hour, where they're charged with committing atrocities against the Japanese and all sentenced to death as a consequence under this law that the Japanese had to pass essentially ex post facto in order to prosecute the Doolittle raiders, quote, as war criminals.
And of course, that's a fancy legal term, but for those of us who are not lawyers, what does it mean to have an ex post facto law, and why is it problematic?
Sure. So it's been problematic since Roman times, and the Romans are by no means softies when it comes to questions of human rights. And the basic idea, ex post facto, after the fact, is that you can't create a law to punish someone for committing a crime that wasn't a crime when they committed it. And this is a principle of law, as I said, that goes well back into the Romans. The Japanese had this principle as part of their law. It's part of international law and American law today. There's actually a clause in the Constitution called the ex post facto clause, because it's ultimately, the difference between justice and revenge. Justice is holding people accountable for the criminal acts they may have committed. Revenge is finding a way to punish people who you hate for independent reasons that are extra legal.
Okay, so we have them now being tried, but can we just chronicle the war crimes committed against the Doolittle raiders, since that's going to be so much the subject of the second trial? So they're waterboarded. What else happens to them in custody that would not be considered consonant with the norms of warfare, the law of armed conflict, the Geneva Conventions?
Sure. So they're denied prisoner of war status, and the Japanese claim that's justified because they're suspected war criminals. They're tortured brutally. Waterboarding is, in some ways, at least the least of it. The Doolittle raiders, the ones who survived, I should say, talked about their confinement, talked about what happened to them after the war. The thing they complained about the most was solitary confinement. They were driven near mad in solitary confinement. After the trial, I mentioned they were all sentenced to death. In fact, the emperor commutes the sentences of all but 3. 3 are shot dead, but the 5 are left to essentially wither away in Japanese prisons in solitary confinement. One dies of malnutrition, a disease called beriberi. Another is on the verge of death by August of 1945. They're subjected to tortures such as putting a bamboo pole, essentially a broom handle, behind their knees, and their thighs are stomped on as a way of leveraging apart their knee joints. There are small little sticks that look like pencils that are jabbed between the webbing of their fingers down into their nerves. They're hung from their hands. They're deprived of sleep. They're subjected to incessant interrogation. One of them is tied up in a straitjacket so tight he can't breathe.
Every form of extreme torture and maltreatment we can imagine. So so you've just walked us through how a number of them don't make it through their confinement, being executed or later dying of malnutrition. But not all of them do die. So let's bring the OSS into the story and tell us the story of the rescue, which is a marvelous story of its own.
Yeah, the OSS, the Office of Strategic Services, often treated as the forerunner of the Central Intelligence Agency, were doing commando operations throughout the Pacific theater throughout 1944, 1945. But after the dropping of the second atomic bomb on Nagasaki, they get a new mission. They're going to be dropped all around the prisoner of war camps that the Japanese have established throughout Asia, and they're there to rescue the prisoners. One of these OSS teams, given the Operation Magpie, drop on the outskirts of a prison camp in Beijing called Feng Tai, which was notorious for its flies. And the OSS team approaches in the early evening hours and immediately takes fire. And they hit the dirt. They just wait until a Japanese lieutenant comes out in a pickup truck and says, "What the hell are you doing?" Because the Japanese soldiers don't know the war is over. This is August 17th, 1945. And only the officers know that there's a truce in place. And they say, had you been dropped, after dark, you'd be all dead. And it's a good thing, you're not very safe. And Ray Nichols, the head of the OSS team, says, if anything happens to my men, you can be sure you will not be very safe. And so they liberate 500 Allied prisoners of war from Feng Tai prison. And they're taken to a posh former geisha house in downtown Beijing, the Grand Hotel des Wagenlit, where they have just this revelrous victory party for the very first time. All these men who've been held for so long, celebrating not only victory but freedom. But as this is all happening, a rumor starts circulating that the Doolittle Raiders were in Feng Tai. But no one in the Grand Hotel des Wagenlit is a Doolittle Raider. And so Ray Nichols goes back to the prison and demands to see the Doolittle Raiders. And after being put off for a bit, says, I know these were here. I know these men were here. I know you saw them last Tuesday. And so the warden of the prison goes to a secret part of the prison where they'd been holding the Doolittle Raiders. And about a half an hour later comes out with these completely emaciated, closely shaven young men who are in these over-billowing army uniforms and completely bewildered. And Ray Nichols walks up to one of them and says, who are you? He says, I'm Chase Nielsen. I was a Doolittle Raider. And Nichols, kind of with this wry smile, I imagine he has a wry smile, says, watch out for this guy. I think he's off his rocker. Because at this point, everyone assumes the Doolittle Raiders are long dead.
In America thought there was anyone in prison. They thought that was completely beyond what Americans had thought, so much so that there was a film made imagining a reunion with the Doolittle Raiders, right?
There was. Well, where all the Doolittles are executed. So in late 1942, early 1943, it's revealed first by the Japanese, and then, once we get the propaganda, we relay it sort of as part of the 1-year anniversary of the Doolittle Raid, that all of the Doolittle Raiders had been executed by the Japanese. And so everyone assumes they're dead. And so when the three of them come out of this secret prison, it's like Lazarus, coming out from the tomb. No one can believe it's possible. And it really galvanizes the public around not only the Doolittle Raid, but things like war crimes prosecutions, in a way that, it was certainly on the table, but it put a very human face on it. The idea of these poor, emaciated American heroes coming out of prison.
That's a fabulous segue to the last of our 4 events that your book covers, which is the second trial. Now set the scene for us. America is happy to have her Doolittle Raiders back, but there's extraordinary anger at Japan, not just for the treatment of the Doolittle Raiders. So this leads to some trials, does it not?
It does. And so the 3 of the Doolittle Raiders are liberated from Feng Tai. One is too sick to move. They actually think he's dead. But they move these 3 Doolittle Raiders back, and on their way back to America, they stop in Chongqing, which is the American Army headquarters in China at the time. And They sit across from an ambitious, highly capable military lawyer by the name of Colonel Ham Young, who takes their story down and then hands the file off to some of his subordinates to say, figure out who's responsible for this. So in 1946, the U.S. Army conducts a trial for the Japanese who have been deemed most responsible for the torture and murder of the Doolittle Raiders. And what's remarkable about this second trial, what's really kind of stunning and precedent-setting, is the Army didn't go after the Kempeitai torturers. They didn't go after Hideki Tojo. Hajime Sugiyama had already killed himself. They went after the lawyers.
I think this is why John Grisham likes your book so much. By the end of it, we've got lawyers battling lawyers, right? So if you don't like lawyers, read this book because you'll find one you do and one you don't.
Yeah, lawyers going against lawyers, prosecuting lawyers. And really what ends up happening in 1946 is the trial of a trial. A lot of the war crimes prosecutions to follow World War II, have very obvious crimes. It's the lynching of airmen was something that was prosecuted a lot. Medical experimentation. You can think of the grand trials like the Nuremberg trials and the Tokyo trials, which essentially put the entire high commands of Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan on trial. But this was a very discrete trial. It was focused solely on the mistreatment of 8 particular Americans and their mistreatment via essentially a pseudo-criminal process, a trial. And so squarely presented in 1946 in an Army courtroom in Shanghai is the question of, well, what is a fair trial? What does international law demand? What is justice to a universal standard that we can hold our enemies to and that we can hold ourselves to? And so it's a really remarkable turnabout. And just as a lawyer, was a real delight to think about prosecuting lawyers and defending lawyers and lawyers defending lawyers.
And so what do they find from what is the ultimate judgment about how the Japanese tried the Doolittle Raiders in the first place, and what does happen to the Japanese on trial?
So, there's this interesting tension because the prosecutors in the case very much have as their trial strategy in showing that the Japanese trial was illegitimate. Their trial strategy is to wrap themselves in the received myth of the Doolittle raid. They present the trial initially, anyway. They present the trial of the Doolittle Raiders by the Japanese as simply the paperwork for murder, right? It was a frame-up job. And the defense lawyers for the Japanese, who are also Army lawyers, these are one of them is actually not a lawyer,
but they're Army officers because this is also a military commission. The Japanese created a law and created a commission to circumvent their own standards, and that's how they tried the Doolittle Raiders. But the United States, after World War II, creates military commissions, which are incredibly important to the ongoing and current, though different, military commissions. And so they create a military commission, try these guys, and decide, hey, that trial you gave the Doolittle Raiders, not okay.
Right. And so it really falls, initially to the defense lawyers to say, well, actually, the Doolittle Raiders were guilty of some atrocities, things like that I talked about before, the attacking of the fishing boats, the attacking of the little boy at school. And this is part of the Doolittle raid, frankly, that's never really been covered in any of the histories, and there are many, of the Doolittle raid, because we don't like complicated history. People, particularly when it comes to World War II, I think there's a certain audience for a fairy tale version of World War II. And, it's a war. Bad things happen in war. Bad people do good things for bad reasons, and good people do bad things for good reasons. And so, this is a complicated story. And I think that was no more true than in 1946, right? If I get hate mail occasionally, and I have today, for bringing up the fact that some of the targets of the Doolittle Raiders were civilian targets, you can imagine how the Army lawyers who were assigned to defend the Japanese were received when they got up in a U.S. Army courtroom in Shanghai in 1946 and accused the Doolittle Raiders of committing atrocities against the still quite hated Japanese.
A bold play is probably a fair way to describe it.
That is a very fair way.
Did the Japanese get a fair trial?
So I'm going to say yes, and that's not necessarily by design. The United States is no more immune than anyone else from the seductions of revenge, from equating justice with the desire for retribution. And certainly things like the Yamashita trial, which is a trial about the the Battle of Manila from 1945 that General Douglas MacArthur puts his thumb on so hard that they actually returned the conviction and death sentence against General Yamashita on December 7th, 1945, the anniversary of Pearl Harbor. And I don't think certainly everyone expected all of the Japanese charged with the torture and murder of the Doolittle raiders to be executed. No one thought any other outcome was either possible or acceptable. And the rules were certainly written to allow for that. However, there is something in America's cultural history that you can trace back to John Adams' defense of the British who conducted the Boston Massacre, where we just want a good, fair trial. There's something that just chafes, particularly the American lawyers, about summary justice. The American officers who are assigned to represent the Japanese, are presented with plenty of opportunities to just stand there like, properly uniformed potted plants to let the inevitable run its course. But they just can't bring themselves to let it happen. And so they end up putting on an aggressive defense that ends really both of their military careers right then and there. But because they've committed to, representing their clients, to giving them a fair trial, to letting the adversarial system run its course, to make the trial not about revenge, but about the truth. And that ultimately, I think, did give the Japanese a fair trial. And the outcome of the trial, the outcome of the book, is, I think, a reflection of that. And so the trial, the results were shocking to everybody. I can say this much: they didn't get the death penalty, as everyone was expecting and demanding. Congressmen called for the trial to be redone so they could get the death penalty. Yet the Army resisted that because it would have violated yet another important international legal norm, which is double jeopardy. And so I do think it was a fair trial. It was a politically contentious trial. I think its outcome was in some ways ambiguous, right? It's not a Hollywood ending, but it's a story really about what justice often can mean. And I think most people who get to the end of the book do have just a sense that justice was done.
Wonderful. Thank you for that. Let's use what few minutes we have remaining to kind of do the thing I love to do with students after we've read a piece of history. So what? What does this matter for today? Why are we reading about these things that are long gone? Now, some of these things seem obvious, but I'm just imagining you reading this trial transcript and reading about these U.S. Army military commissions with strong protections for individual rights and broad acceptance in the international system. How did it feel to read that while participating yourself in this strange legal universe that is the Guantanamo Bay military commissions?
Honestly, it put on me a kind of weight of history. And I know that sounds really grandiose, but, I think one of the things that I certainly look to for history is not fairy tales. You want to look back at people who really struggled to do the right thing, and struggled under all sorts of pressures to try and do the right thing, despite what was easy, despite what had really negative consequences professionally, personally, how you name it. And that was really kind of the weight of that fell on me. Was I was looking at people who were literally doing exactly what I was doing, representing the most hated people in America. In military trials who were designed really for one outcome, which was to execute most of them. And to really just commit, irrespective of the professional ramifications, irrespective of the personal ramifications, commit to seeing that justice was done, commit to your role to protect things like what we used to call truth, justice in the American way, due process, constitutional protections, the prohibition on ex post facto laws, the prohibition on torture. And so there's a weight on that, because just as I was sitting there reading this transcript and seeing these lawyers struggle at times against almost themselves to try and do the right thing, it was very familiar. And it was an interesting precedent to see actual people, right? Not statues, not heroes, just actual people struggling to do the right thing and by and large succeeding, even though they fell short sometimes.
Okay, that's fascinating. Let me ask you this. Do you think that, separate from the issues of obviously we want our government to conform to international norms and its own treaties regarding torture and things of this nature, but do you think there is a place for military commissions in the first place? In other words, could these things, we've had them before, it seems it's clear because there are separate laws for certain kinds of crimes or separate needs, I guess, by institutions. So how much do the problems lay in the existence of military commissions, or just that we seem in these last few years, the 20 years since September 11th, to be using military commissions not very well?
I think the actual problem is why you're using military commissions. And so the use of military commissions, particularly after the Second World War, was actually a great revolution in thinking about, the humanity of your enemy. You go back to the Romans. How did the Romans treat their defeated enemies, right? They hung them publicly in celebration. Even Napoleon never got a trial before being sequestered off in Elba. And, one of the great innovations of the Second World War was to actually hold your enemies to a standard of justice that basically complied with the Golden Rule, right? That essentially asserted these are standards for which we would be willing to submit ourselves. And so just to give you a sense of that, at the Tehran Conference in 1943, it's the first real discussion between Churchill, Stalin, and Roosevelt as to what to do with the defeated Nazis. And Stalin, at least according to Churchill's memoirs, sort of blithely proposes creating a hit list of 50,000 Nazis who are going to be executed upon identification. And Roosevelt is supposed to have said, well, really, wouldn't 49,000 be enough? Right? Just kind of
it drives the point home.
Right. Sort of classic Roosevelt there. And Churchill writes about being utterly repulsed by this in his memoirs. But the truth was Churchill was entirely in favor. As late as the Potsdam Conference and even well into 1945 afterwards, he continued to advocate for essentially creating a list of top Nazis to be executed. He was not a supporter of things like the Nuremberg trial, like applying any kind of international standard of justice. And throughout, the very end of the war, but it's something that the United States especially pushed for. I think in part because the United States, going back to Tocqueville, is understood to be a kind of a litigious society, but we take the law and trials very seriously as records of history. But if I can say one thing just in defense of Churchill, and Stalin for that matter, is by historical standards,
proposition.
Right, Stalin's proposition, I should say. But by historical standards, that's not unusual, right? It wouldn't have all been surprising by looking back on the course of history preceding 1945 for there to just be mass executions of believed war criminals, the enemy leadership. But that changed in 1945 in ways that we now completely take for granted. So the military commissions, were an innovation towards greater humanity in 1945. And I don't think that's true today.
I think we're coming near the end of our time here. So I'd like to ask you, reflecting back both as a practitioner working in military commissions and now having written a history of these trials and these events, what matters most for the interested and conscientious follower of national security affairs today about your story? What should people know about the long-term effects of the Doolittle raid? I mean, there is an argument woven beautifully throughout this book that culminates in the Geneva Conventions and Common Article 3. How should people think back to Doolittle and Tokyo and think forward about how the law of armed conflict and the rights and appropriate conduct in warfare?
The very last sentence of the book is a quotation from the Geneva Conventions of 1949, and it's specifically a part of the Geneva Conventions called the regularly constituted court provision, which says that no punishment shall be handed down except upon the judgment of a regularly constituted court, affording all judicial guarantees recognized as indispensable by civilized people. And I think that, at least maybe I'm just a lawyer, and so when you're a hammer, you see the world as a nail. But I think that particular provision of the Geneva Conventions is probably the single greatest expression of, subjecting power to the restraints of humanity and reason and logic, to essentially the Enlightenment values that the United States was literally founded upon, and that were not universally shared by any stretch in 1945. became international law, became the norms that governed all the world, all the people of the world by 1949. And so, I think that's in a small way, perhaps, that's a legacy that, Americans really should be proud of and protect and be concerned about when we see our own government becoming more revanchist and trying to undermine, a legacy that literally, 500,000 Americans died to establish. And why I think, there is something particularly poignant about the regularly constituted court provision, at least for today, is the Supreme Court in 2006, in a case called Hamdan versus Rumsfeld, in which it struck down the Bush administration's military commissions. What did it rely upon? It relied upon the regularly constituted court provision. These are norms and values that we established in 1945 and again in treaties in 1949. And we should not let ourselves be like our former enemies, to give into the urge of revenge, to give into our sort of darker desires to see the world in us versus them terms, and forsake things that we fought very hard. We spent a lot of blood and treasure to make the world a better place. And so that's sort of hopefully the lasting and even optimistic takeaway that I hope people get from this book, is that, the world can be made better than the one we received. But it also can be made worse if we give up on the things that we at least claim we believe.
Dr. Michel Parody, thank you so much for joining us here today on Horns of a Dilemma. It was a pleasure talking to you.
My pleasure entirely.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Horns of a Dilemma, and please don't forget to visit our website at tnsr.org.